In a dazzling hub teeming with life, Jake's brash antics outside Buckingham Palace ignite a simmering tension, drawing the eyes of tourists and locals alike. Armed with nothing but a beer and a misguided sense of entitlement, he believes he can challenge one of Britain's steadfast symbols, the Royal Guard. But when his laughter fades and the Guard's stony resolve sharpens, Jake may find that the price of mockery is far steeper than he ever imagined. What happens when an unsuspecting tourist stumbles into a battle of dignity and tradition? The sun had transformed as the day progressed, casting a golden hue over the busy streets of London. Tourists and locals pooled together in front of Buckingham Palace, with chatter bubbling. A cacophony of excited exchanges mingled with the occasional laugh or gasp from those witnessing the regal splendor of the palace. The grandeur loomed in contrast to the modern rhythm of the city, where storefronts offered everything from quintessential British souvenirs to the latest tech gadgets. Here the atmosphere was alive. The air burst with the fragrances of street food, sweetened by a breeze that carried the sounds of a distant street performer echoing across the plaza. Amidst the lively scene stood Jake, a 28-year-old brimming with a tumultuous concoction of confidence and arrogance. Dressed in a casual t-shirt emblazoned with a goofy slogan, he exuded an aura of entitlement that came from wealth rather than wisdom. His dark hair was tousled, and a slight scruff adorned his chin, not quite the rugged charm he imagined. In his hand, the half-empty bottle of beer glistened, and with every sip, Jake felt himself swell with bravado. He was, in his opinion, the center of the universe, and London was merely a stage for his next act. Jake, surrounded by a few equally raucous friends, animatedly recounted stories from their travels, insisting that his wild antics would only be amplified in the presence of, as he called them, the guards in funny hats. The ancient traditions and solemnity of those who stood watch felt to him like delicious bait, a moment ripe for mockery. The royal guard stood motionless, clad in their red tunics and bearskin hats, epitomes of stoicism, offering an almost comical contrast to Jake's bubbling personality. The stony expressions on their faces matched the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, symbolizing British dignity and the enduring legacy of tradition. With their eyes fixed on the guard, Jake felt a mischievous urge surge through him. He leaned closer to his friends, who were encircled by a handful of intrigued onlookers, and with a lopsided grin, he hatched a plan. "Watch this," he exclaimed, oblivious to the growing tension in the air, as the crowd began to shift uneasily. He was determined to provoke a reaction, convinced that his audacity would cultivate laughter and astonishment. "Oi, mate!" he shouted across the expanse, his voice piercing through the attentive murmurs of tourists. "Is that all you got? Just standing there like a statue?" As his words echoed, he took a step forward, emboldened by a few cheers from his friends. The royal guard remained unfazed, a living embodiment of patience. However, a few tourists began to whisper, disapproval woven into the soft tones. A small child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing at the guard and advocating for the unyielding figure. "Mummy, he looks like a soldier. Look how still he is." But Jake, too far gone in his own flamboyant theatrics, continued to taunt, leaning closer and raising his bottle in a mock salute. Jake's laughter rang hollow, muffled by the underlying sound of simmering discontent. He had not noticed the shift in the crowd, how some faces twisted toward displeasure, and a few shook their heads. They were caught in the crossfire of his bravado, the camaraderie among friends, and the core values of respect for tradition. As an unsuspecting pigeon fluttered from its resting place, startled by the louder-than-usual atmosphere, Jake seized the moment. He held his beer high. "Watch me make him laugh," he shouted. Just as he was about to enact his foolish plan, a gust of wind rustled through the square, drawing attention, as though fate were setting the stage for calamity. Seizing the moment, he hurled the contents of his bottle toward the guard, expecting applause or at least a round of roars from the onlookers. But instead, a collective gasp filled the space, followed by an eerie silence that compounded the weight of Jake's arrogance. The guard's piercing glare met Jake's wide-eyed expression, halting the laughter and sending a ripple of unease through the gathered tourists. The scene shifted, anticipatory murmurs surfacing among the crowd. A potent mix of disapproval and astonishment settled heavily in the air. In that piercing moment, the reality of his actions began to dawn on Jake. Perhaps he had miscalculated. The air outside Buckingham Palace crackled with charged energy as bystanders watched the unfolding drama, their eyes darting between Jake and the unwavering figure of the royal guard. A chorus of gasps and laughter echoed around them, but an undercurrent of disapproval simmered beneath the surface, reflecting a growing sense of unease. Jake, determined not to back down, leaned against the wrought iron railing, a foolish grin plastered on his face as he glanced at his friends, who had pulled out their phones to capture the antics on video. "Come on, look at him! What a statue!" Jake jeered, raising his beer aloft as if it were a trophy. "Bet he'd crack a smile if I tickled him." His friends howled with laughter, but others in the crowd frowned, their expressions softening into discomfort at Jake's increasingly bold provocations. The Royal Guard, a bastion of stoic resolve, stood impervious to Jake's taunts, eyes locked forward, trapped in their resolutely silent vigil. Jake reveled in being the center of attention, unaware that the amusement of the crowd had quickly turned to concern. With a whoop of misguided bravery, Jake stepped closer, his bravado a flimsy shield against reality. What's the worst that could happen? Dude's a glorified mannequin. His boldness masked an inner tremor, though he wouldn't dare show it. A couple standing nearby shook their heads. Perhaps they thought it was time someone put this insufferable tourist in his place. "Oi, back off the guard, mate!" A man with a thick accent shouted from the back, arms crossed and eyebrows knitted in anger. The crowd murmured in discontent, forming an informal council against Jake's antics. "Who's shouting?" Jake scoffed, already feeling the tide of support wane beneath him. He focused back on the guard, raising the beer bottle for a mock toast. "Here's to British tradition. Isn't it a bit outdated? How about a little action?" The Royal Guard remained unmoved, but within Jake, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout. His bravado felt a tad hollow now, as the cheers from his friends began to fade into a muffled background noise of dissent. Ignoring the unease that tugged at him, Jake nipped the last of the beer, raising the empty bottle like a weapon and swaggering dangerously close to the rigid sentinel. "Let's see if you even—" With disdain aimed at the onlookers, Jake launched the empty beer bottle, aiming for a nearby trash bin but inadvertently hitting the guard's boot. The crowd's collective gasp cut through the atmosphere like a knife and turned their expressions to horror. The guard's proud posture radiated unwavering strength, and for the first time, Jake felt a hint of hesitation. A ripple of tension crashed over the spectators, morphing the laughter into uneasy silence. They exchanged glances, many of them caught in a liminal space between applause for his audacity and outrage for his insensitivity. "Do you even realize what you've done?" a woman whispered to her friend, glancing nervously from Jake to the guard. "Someone needs to teach him a lesson," came a reply, sharp and quiet as a breath. In that moment, Jake caught the guard's gaze, cold, piercing, and entirely unimpressed. The jeering bravado left him, and a knot formed in his stomach. "It was just," he stuttered, suddenly lacking confidence as other tourists glared at him, expressions teetering between amusement and disdain. A horse, part of the ceremonial police presence nearby, shifted, spooked by the commotion surrounding Jake. It reared, hooves clattering against the cobblestones, and in an instant, chaos unfurled. "No, not the horse!" Jake shouted, instinctively backing away. But he lost his footing on the slick pavement, tumbling backward. A collective gasp arose as Jake landed unceremoniously on the ground, his face flushing crimson. Laughter broke out over the crowd, the kind he had sought but never expected to earn in such a way. The horses, a symbol of British tradition, chose this moment to suddenly trot closer, further enhancing the absurdity of his situation. "What comes around goes around, eh?" someone remarked from the crowd. Laughter infectious as it rippled through, rendering Jake the jester. As he scrambled back to his feet, humiliated and seething with a mix of rage and embarrassment, he noticed the Royal Guard still unmoving, the embodiment of dignity amidst the chaos. The guard stood tall, merely a statue among chaos, as Jake attempted to regain some sense of composure. "You think this is funny? I just slipped," Jake yelled, half indignant, half afraid. Look around, mate. You've just been knocked down a peg. Another voice chimed in, laughter erupting anew as the ridicule mounted. Jake's bravado crumbled completely. Shadows of humiliation cloaked him, inching towards anger, frustration seething under his skin. He turned to his friends, their faces a mix of pity and bemusement, who now filmed the farcical clash unfold. As laughter filled the air, Jake took a deep breath, and for the first time, he faced a choice. Would he contemplate the lesson unfolding before him, or would he bury himself deeper in the swirling waves of his own arrogance? The crowd, once on his side, had turned, leaving him isolated in his folly. The hidden notion of respect, he realized, had weight, a heavy chain that held firm and tangled him in a snare of discontent. His gaze flickered back to the royal guard, who showed no signs of reaction, no glimmer of amusement or failure to recognize Jake's existence. He was left with a burning question on his lips, one he couldn't utter aloud, heavy in the charged air between them. Had he misunderstood the true mantle of dignity? The crowd buzzed with tension, a cacophony of gasps, laughter, and hushed whispers as Jake lay sprawled on the ground. He blinked, confusion and embarrassment coloring his cheeks a deep shade of crimson. The world spun slightly, but the gravity of the moment settled over him like a heavy blanket as the laughter climaxed. Not one of amusement at his routine, but of schadenfreude at his comeuppance. A few steps away, the royal guard remained unmoved, a statue frozen in time, embodying the solemn tradition that Jake had so carelessly disrespected. Jake scrambled to his feet, wiping dirt and humiliation from his jeans. "You think this is funny?" he barked at the crowd, anger bubbling beneath his skin. His bravado returned like a shield, a desperate attempt to reclaim some dignity. "You're all just jealous of my fun." A gust of wind whipped around him, carrying away his bravado, and with it any remnants of camaraderie among the spectators. A whisper traveled through the crowd, escalating into a chorus of dissent against Jake's antics. "It's called respect," one onlooker shouted, leaving Jake momentarily speechless. The royal guard remained stoic, their eyes fixed ahead, portraying a sense of strength through silence. It was a striking contrast to Jake's escalating frustration, his once cocky demeanor diluted by the unexpected reality now surrounding him. The silence from the guard spoke volumes. Here was someone who had endured scorn and mockery, yet didn't allow it to provoke them into response. Jake felt a tiny crack in the armor of his ignorance beginning to form. "Do you even understand what that uniform means?" A woman in the crowd challenged, her voice steady, yet sharp enough to slice through the heated air. "That guard has stood there for centuries, preserving history and dignity. You think you can just mock that because you think it's funny?" Her words echoed in Jake's ears, a stark confrontation that sparked a flicker of awareness deep inside him. He looked back at the guard, who still bore the weight of their post with unwavering strength. With each second, the realization deepened. In his pursuit of thrill, he had trampled over something far more significant than his fleeting amusement. The hostile glances from the crowd solidified, their collective voice igniting a moment of clarity within him. I didn't mean any harm," Jake stammered, his bravado deflating. "I was just trying to—" "Trying to what?" the woman interjected, frustration tightening in her features. "Trying to entertain yourself at someone else's expense? What do you think tradition is?" Jake's heart sank as he faced the truth. The stakes were higher than he had allowed himself to comprehend, rooted in respect and understanding that surpassed his brief escapade of fun. In that moment of insight, he felt his earlier arrogance wane, supplanted by a pulse of humility. As he fell silent, his defenses stripped away, the sound of laughter began to soften, replaced by an air of contemplation. It was a turning point not just for him, but for the atmosphere itself, a shared lesson reverberating through the crowd. "Maybe it's time to reconsider what you're here for," someone muttered, their tone filled with empathy more than disdain. Now the seriousness of the moment hung in the air, ready to redefine Jake's perception. Jake picked himself off the ground, feeling the heat of humiliation wash over him as laughter still echoed in his ears. The crowd began dispersing, their curious gazes shifting back to the more dignified sights of Buckingham Palace. In that moment, he saw the royal guard standing tall, unwavering, their stoic expression a stark reminder of the arrogance he had displayed only moments before. He felt an unfamiliar emotion creeping in, an urge to apologize. Stepping forward, he hesitated, but finally called out, "I'm sorry." The guard, unmoved, continued to stand resolute, reinforcing the significance of their position. It was clear to Jake that respect was earned, not granted in jest. As the crowd thinned, he overheard snippets of conversations reflecting on his antics, some sympathetic, others scathing. He recognized that he had crossed a line by mocking a tradition steeped in history. This realization sank in deeply as Jake walked away, the ache of his bruised ego mingling with an unexpected sense of personal growth. With every step, he internalized the lesson of that day. Dignity is not a game to be played. He vowed to carry this newfound respect back home, understanding that true strength lies not in bravado, but in honoring the heritage and people around us. This moment would remain a pivotal chapter in his life, marking the transformation from a self-absorbed tourist to a responsible traveler.